The room didn't ease into chaos. It snapped. 1 second everyone was still settling into their seats, and the next Natalie leaned forward and said exactly what Jasmine did not want to hear. There was no yelling, no theatrics, no dramatic build-up, just a direct call-out that cut through the noise and instantly shifted the energy in the room. You could feel it. Conversation stopped. Faces tightened. This wasn't another emotional vent session. This was a challenge. Natalie didn't soften her words. She didn't walk them back. She didn't apologize for how they might land. She looked straight at Jasmine and refused to accept the version of events Jasmine had been leaning on all season. And in that moment, something telling happened. Jasmine didn't argue back. She didn't defend herself with facts or explanations. She didn't even escalate. She shut down. Her eyes dropped. Her body turned away. She reached for the exit emotionally before anyone could follow up. This has become a familiar pattern. When the conversation gets uncomfortable, when accountability starts to surface, Jasmine disappears from it. Not physically every time, but mentally. Silence. Tears. Withdrawal. Anything except staying in the moment and answering the question being asked. That's when the tension really set in. Because Natalie wasn't playing the usual tell-all game. She wasn't there to trade insults or perform outrage. She was there to finish a thought. And she wasn't going to let Jasmine escape it. The longer Jasmine avoided responding, the louder the silence became. Other cast members shifted in their seats, unsure whether to step in or let it play out. The audience could sense it too. This wasn't about who was right in a single argument anymore. It was about a pattern finally being put under a spotlight. At this point, the question became unavoidable. Is Jasmine protecting herself because she's overwhelmed and hurt? Or is she avoiding accountability because the truth is harder to sit with than the narrative she's been telling? Those two things can look very similar on the surface, but they come from very different places. And what makes this moment even more uncomfortable is that once you understand what Gino has been doing behind the scenes, this entire confrontation starts to look very different. Natalie stayed exactly where she was, calm, unmoving, unwilling to back down. Jasmine, on the other hand, retreated further into silence, and hovering between them was Gino, quiet, observant, saying just enough to stay out of the blast radius. At least, that's how it looked at first. To understand why that moment hit as hard as it did, you have to rewind just a little. Not to rehash every fight, but to remember where Jasmine and Gino actually were walking into this tell-all. Because despite how chaotic their relationship looks on screen, they didn't arrive here as strangers at war. They arrived as two people carrying months of unresolved damage, layered on top of fear, resentment, and a lot of unspoken pressure. By the time the cameras rolled, their trust was already cracked. The open relationship conversation alone left more questions than answers. What started as a supposed solution quickly became another source of insecurity. Lines were blurry, boundaries kept shifting, and instead of creating honesty, it exposed just how little faith they had in each other. Jasmine felt controlled and dismissed. Gino felt betrayed and humiliated. Neither one felt safe, and both were keeping score. On top of that sat the immigration stress, which never stays in the background no matter how much people pretend it does. Every argument carried extra weight because the consequences weren't just emotional. They were legal, financial, and life-altering. For Jasmine, the pressure was constant. Her future, her child, and her stability all felt uncertain. For Gino, the fear looked different. He wasn't worried about survival in the same way. He was worried about being used, embarrassed, or made to look foolish again. That imbalance matters. It shapes how power shows up in their conversations, even when no one names it out loud. Jasmine's reactions didn't come from nowhere. She was stressed, overwhelmed, and visibly exhausted. Anyone watching could see that. But stress doesn't erase responsibility. And pain doesn't excuse patterns that hurt other people. That's where things get complicated. Because sympathy and accountability can exist at the same time. For a long time, Jasmine's emotional responses worked. Tears stopped conversations. Leaving the room reset the tone. People backed off, unsure of how far to push without looking cruel. It became an unspoken rule that when Jasmine hit her limit, everyone else was supposed to pause. But there comes a point when tears stop being a shield and start becoming a question, and the cast was already getting close to that line. Gino, meanwhile, learned how to stay just calm enough to look reasonable. He spoke carefully. He avoided explosive reactions. And on the surface, that made him appear like the stable one in the relationship. But stability can also be a strategy, especially when it keeps the focus on someone else's emotional breakdown instead of your own behavior. By the time they sat on that tell-all stage, this wasn't just about one argument or one accusation. It was about whether the people around them were still listening with empathy, or whether they had started watching with judgment. And the shift from one to the other was already quietly underway. Jasmine has never been a simple character to read, and that's part of why the reactions to her are so divided. On one hand, there is a very real woman on that stage who has been through visible stress. New motherhood changes everything. Your body, your emotions, your sense of control, all of it shifts at once. Add immigration uncertainty, public scrutiny, and a relationship that never feels stable, and it makes sense that she often looks overwhelmed. None of that is fake, and none of it should be dismissed. But acknowledging her pain doesn't mean ignoring her behavior. Over and over again, when conversations move toward accountability, Jasmine's response is the same. She exits. Sometimes it's physical, walking away or turning her body. Other times it's emotional, shutting down, crying, or refusing to engage. These moments don't happen randomly. They happen at very specific points, usually right when someone challenges the gap between what she says and what she does. Jasmine talks about wanting honesty, safety, and respect. She says she wants to be heard and understood. But when others try to address how her actions affect them, the conversation collapses. Instead of clarification, there's retreat. Instead of explanation, there's silence. That contrast is what keeps following her from episode to episode, and it's what made the tell-all so tense. People weren't reacting to her emotions alone. They were reacting to a pattern they recognized. It's also important to separate intent from impact. Jasmine may not be consciously trying to manipulate situations, but emotional avoidance still has consequences. When someone repeatedly shuts down difficult conversations, it shifts the burden onto everyone else. They either back off and let things go unresolved, or they push harder and risk being labeled cruel or insensitive. That dynamic creates power, whether it's intentional or not. And this is exactly why Natalie's response was about to change the tone of the entire room. Postpartum anxiety and fear deserve compassion. They explain why someone might feel raw or reactive. But they don't explain why accountability only seems to surface when it's convenient. Viewers and cast members alike started noticing that Jasmine's most intense emotional reactions appeared at moments when she was being asked to sit with discomfort, rather than express it. The tell-all magnified this because there was nowhere to escape to. No private space, no time to reset off camera. Every silence felt heavier. Every tear carried more meaning. And instead of diffusing tension, those reactions began to raise new questions. Was Jasmine overwhelmed, or was she avoiding the consequences of her own choices? By this point, the room was waiting for an answer, waiting for ownership, waiting for something other than another emotional exit. Jasmine stayed quiet, her posture closed, her voice absent. And Natalie, watching all of this unfold, made it clear through her stillness that she was no longer willing to let silence count as a resolution. Natalie didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult. She didn't spiral into the kind of chaos that usually defines these confrontations. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She stayed present. While Jasmine withdrew, Natalie leaned in. While emotions filled the room, Natalie anchored herself in language that was clear and deliberate. That contrast alone shifted the balance of power. For many viewers, this is the moment Natalie gained credibility. Not because she was kinder, but because she was consistent. She wasn't reacting to tears. She wasn't chasing validation. She was responding to behavior. She listened, waited, and when she spoke, she stayed focused on the point she was making instead of the feelings it stirred. In a space where emotion often drowns out meaning, that kind of restraint reads as authority. Of course, not everyone sided with her. Natalie has her own history of intensity, bluntness, and emotional rigidity. Some viewers saw her refusal to soften as cold. Others felt she lacked empathy for what Jasmine was going through. And those criticisms aren't without merit. Natalie isn't gentle, and she doesn't cushion her words for comfort. But in this setting, that quality worked in her favor. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to be heard. What made the moment land was timing. Natalie spoke after watching Jasmine retreat again and again, after watching tears halt progress, after watching silence replace answers. By the time Natalie stepped in, the room was already fatigued by the cycle. Her refusal to bend felt less like cruelty and more like someone finally drawing a line. Jasmine, meanwhile, stayed quiet. Not in reflection, but in withdrawal. Her body language told a story of defense rather than engagement. And with every second that passed, Natalie's composure sharpened the contrast. One woman was uncomfortable, but present. The other was overwhelmed, but unreachable. The audience didn't need commentary to understand what was happening. The dynamic spoke for itself. What no one was saying out loud yet was that this tension didn't start with just the two women. It was being quietly fed by someone sitting right between them. Natalie's strength in that moment came from her refusal to attack emotion. She didn't accuse Jasmine of being weak or dramatic. She questioned actions. She asked why apologies never came, why conversations never finished, why accountability always stalled at the same point. These weren't emotional jabs. They were practical questions that demanded answers. And then she stopped. She didn't fill the silence. She didn't rescue the moment. She waited. That pause was heavy, intentional, and uncomfortable. Because by stripping away emotion and focusing on behavior, Natalie left nowhere for the conversation to hide. The room held its breath, waiting to see who would finally step into that space and respond. Gino stayed calm. Too calm. While the room churned with emotion, he leaned back into a tone built on technicalities. Words like paperwork, timelines, status, not love, not repair. And every time he spoke, the focus slid away from how people felt and landed on how things looked on paper. On screen, that choice carried weight. Calm sounds safe until you notice what calm avoids. When immigration entered the conversation, the temperature shifted. Gino spoke about deportation in a detached way, almost like a theoretical outcome instead of a life-altering threat. In my opinion, the language mattered more than the intent. When someone frames immigration as leverage during conflict, it changes the power balance instantly. Jasmine didn't need to be told outright. The implication hung in the air. Security lived with him. Fear lived with her. He also kept circling back to being wronged. The cheating, the secrecy, the embarrassment. Those points stayed on repeat, while accountability stayed vague. There was little space for resolution, and plenty of space for grievance. Viewers noticed the pattern. Every conversation returned to what he lost, not what broke between them. Harm became a scoreboard. The timeline questions made things murkier. Dates shifted. Sequences blurred. Statements contradicted earlier footage. Not dramatically, but enough to raise eyebrows. Small inconsistencies stack up when trust already feels thin. In my opinion, Gino leaned into confusion as a shield. When details stay fuzzy, clarity never fully forms. And without clarity, responsibility drifts. The calm everyone trusted was about to face a test, and family voices were already moving closer to the center of the room. Another detail landed quietly. Gino spoke about separating Jasmine from his family as a protective move, framed as safety, framed as privacy. Yet the effect looked isolating. When one partner controls access to support systems, even unintentionally, the balance tilts. Again, no accusation here, only observation. On screen, intention and impact parted ways. What stood out most was what he did not do. He did not de-escalate. He did not bridge. He did not invite understanding between the two women locked in conflict. Instead, he positioned himself as the injured party, who deserved validation first. Resolution later. That order matters. When validation replaces repair, conflicts stretch longer and cut deeper. The fixation on immigration fraud also rang loud. It overshadowed emotional accountability. Viewers felt the shift. The conversation stopped being about trust and turned into a courtroom argument about motives. In my opinion, focusing on fraud framed the relationship as transactional at the exact moment it needed humanity. Paperwork replaced people. As Natalie held her ground and Jasmine withdrew, Gino stayed centered in his narrative. Calm voice, measured pace, controlled posture. Yet control itself became the message. The calm started to read less like peace and more like distance. When someone stays composed while everyone else strains, it forces a question. Is this stability or disengagement? The room felt the change. Side eyes replaced nods. Silence stretched longer. The cast stopped reacting and started evaluating. Gino's words hung there, neat and careful, but no longer unchallenged. You could sense others preparing to step in, not with emotion, but with memory. Dana leaned forward. Michelle followed. Their expressions carried recognition, not surprise. They had heard these explanations before, and this time they weren't planning to let calm slide past unanswered. Dana didn't hold back. She leaned in with that unmistakable energy, eyes narrowing, tone firm. It wasn't anger exactly, more a refusal to accept dodged accountability. Every carefully worded excuse from Gino met a challenge. Wait, she said, so you're telling us this happened, but it wasn't your fault? The phrasing hit the room like a splash of cold water. On screen, you could almost feel the tension turn physical. This wasn't a private argument anymore. This was group accountability in motion. Michelle jumped in immediately after. She layered her questions with pointed reminders of past statements. Last week, you said, she began, making the room collectively rewind. Her approach wasn't aggressive, but surgical. Each phrase exposed gaps in Gino's version of events. The contrast between his calm delivery and the cast's focused scrutiny made his control feel smaller, almost fragile. For viewers, this is the moment you start rooting for the cast, feeling like a hidden jury has just stepped forward. Then Loren pushed her cards onto the table. Logic checks replaced emotional appeals. Her voice cut through the tension, precise and piercing. She questioned why patterns repeated, why clarity was avoided, and why consequences never seemed to land. The audience got to see an analytical lens on behavior, which subtly framed Jasmine and Gino's interactions in a more structured way. The chaos was still there, but now it had a frame. And that frame makes everything that comes after land harder. Andre didn't waste words. He went blunt. Every question aimed straight at inconsistencies, ignoring polite pacing. The energy shifted again. You could almost hear the collective audience lean forward, nodding along. Blunt truth has a way of cracking facades, and on screen, the effect was immediate. Gino's calm mask began to show small cracks. Observers started noticing details they might have missed before: hesitation, phrasing, tiny pauses that revealed what words did not. The group dynamic created a new kind of pressure. Private conflict is messy but contained. Public, with multiple voices aligned, it amplifies stakes. Behavior is judged not just for intent but for impact. Every denial, every sidestep is magnified. For viewers, this is satisfying because it mirrors how people process fairness and accountability in real life. You feel the room becoming a microcosm of social judgment. And now the conversation is about to pivot from love to survival, and the stakes are suddenly much higher. The tension built as immigration loomed in the background again. Every phrase carried double weight. What was a personal dispute became a question of power, access, and consequence. Words that might have been brushed off earlier now demanded attention. The cast wasn't just watching anymore. They were weighing evidence, pointing out gaps, and forcing Gino to answer publicly. Each question, each pause, each deliberate look added layers to the moment. And for viewers, the suspense doubled, because the implications went beyond Jasmine and Gino. They touched family, freedom, and future choices. The room shifted, eyes locked, energy taut. The word immigration hung unspoken, but everyone knew its presence. How each person responded next would define who held control and who was exposed. Jasmine's position was clear from the start. She wasn't willing to marry for immigration purposes, even under pressure. On camera, the tension was almost tangible. Lawyers and advisors repeatedly suggested a path that would secure her stay, but Jasmine's refusal wasn't about rebellion. It was about control over her own life. She feared the imbalance that marrying purely for legal security could create. This wasn't an abstract concept. It was practical, emotional, and deeply personal. The baby added an extra layer, making every decision more than just about paperwork. Every choice now carried long-term consequences for her child. At the same time, the audience could see why Gino emphasized legal clarity. He framed his concern around rules, obligations, and the potential fallout of missteps. His language often crossed into threats, but behind that was fear. Fear of losing access, of being caught in a legal tangle that could disrupt the family unit. On screen, his calm tone made it seem rational, but the repetition created pressure that felt heavy, almost suffocating. Viewers were left weighing, is this practical caution or controlling behavior? The line between care and coercion was razor thin, and the episode made that clear. Jasmine's hesitation highlighted a central contradiction that had been simmering all season. Emotional vulnerability was met with judgment, yet practical concerns from Gino were interpreted as manipulative. The baby was the axis around which morality and logistics spun. Every audience member had to ask, can love exist when survival is tangled into it? And if it does, what does compromise look like without tipping power unfairly to one side? It was the perfect storm for ethical ambiguity. But just wait. Later, you'll see how this same tension plays out in a moment that exposes hypocrisy across the board. The show also highlighted that this dilemma wasn't unique. Other couples faced similar stress points, decisions that mixed love, obligation, and legality. The framing wasn't judgmental, but it forced reflection. Audiences could feel empathy for Jasmine while still noticing patterns of avoidance and timing in how she handled confrontation. Her fear was legitimate, but so were the consequences of avoiding direct answers or action. The baby made these stakes urgent, because in every frame, viewers saw how personal decisions rippled outward. Meanwhile, Gino's insistence on structure and timelines reinforced a recurring theme. When immigration is involved, private conflicts suddenly carry public stakes. Actions are scrutinized, motives questioned, and consequences amplified. Watching these interactions play out, the audience is invited into a moral debate with no clear solution. It's uncomfortable, it's tense, and it keeps viewers glued to the screen because everyone's judgment is provisional until the next revelation. The contrast between love and survival, personal choice and legal reality, created an emotional push-pull. Every hesitation, every tear, every measured refusal added weight to the moment. It wasn't about who was right or wrong, it was about navigating a reality where love intersects with rules and obligations in messy, emotionally charged ways. And as the camera pans to other couples, the same patterns emerge, echoing the tension and leaving everyone wondering how far people will bend for love, or how much control they will exert to survive. Tensions between Loren and Elizabeth flared almost immediately. Words were clipped, voices edged with frustration, and the room's energy felt like it could snap at any moment. It wasn't about a single betrayal, it was about perception. Every glance, every comment carried weight, and suddenly body image and self-worth became weapons. Accusations flew subtly, disguised as concern, and suddenly social power mattered more than facts. Who could speak loudest? Who would be believed and who was dismissed? The hierarchy of attention dictated accountability, and it was messy. Phones became another battlefield. A glance at a message, a notification seen at the wrong time, and assumptions multiplied. Everyone was judging, but the rules weren't applied evenly. The women who asserted themselves first often set the narrative, while quieter voices were questioned or ignored. Viewers could see the pattern. Accountability wasn't consistent, and double standards thrived in the chaos. One person's outburst was considered valid, another's an overreaction. Power dynamics were invisible, but undeniable. Jasmine's shadow lingered over these moments. Even when the conflict wasn't directly about her, the energy in the room constantly returned to her behavior. Her tears, her avoidance, her refusals, these were reference points against which everyone else's actions were measured. The audience saw how one individual's patterns could ripple through multiple relationships, creating recurring tensions and feeding judgments across the cast. And here's the kicker. Every twist and argument subtly leads back to Jasmine and Gino one last time. By highlighting Loren and Elizabeth, the show exposed a broader truth. Female conflict is often weaponized, judged, and dissected differently depending on who speaks and how loudly. Social optics dictated who was the victim, who was the instigator, and who could claim moral high ground. The audience was left questioning why certain behaviors were excused while others were criticized, and how empathy shifted depending on alliances, previous narratives, and emotional performance. At the same time, this segment reminded viewers that the chaos wasn't random. Each argument, each accusation, threaded back to earlier dynamics. Jasmine's avoidance, Gino's quiet insistence, and Natalie's firm presence had set up a framework where everyone's actions were magnified. Conflicts that might have been minor in isolation became charged because of past choices, reputations, and the audience's own expectations. By the end, there was no neat resolution. The room still hummed with tension, voices rising and falling, but no clear closure was offered. Accountability remained fragmented, patterns unbroken, and the stakes unresolved. Viewers were left hanging, waiting for the final confrontation that would tie these threads together and bring the spotlight fully back to the central drama. The room felt heavier than ever. Jasmine sat quietly, arms crossed, eyes darting but avoiding direct engagement. When Natalie spoke, there was no softening, no hedging, just clarity. She called out behavior, refused to excuse it, and demanded accountability. For a moment, the energy shifted. The audience could feel it. This was the point where confrontation became undeniable. Jasmine didn't respond the way some expected. There was no apology, no acknowledgement beyond a guarded shrug. Her tears, earlier tools of escape, had lost their power. The cast had stopped cushioning her. Natalie left without the validation Jasmine might have hoped for, leaving a silence that was impossible to ignore. It was not dramatic yelling. It was a quiet, intense statement. Behavior matters more than emotion, and some actions have consequences. Gino's presence complicated everything. He stayed composed, but every line he spoke carried a weight of grievance. His focus wasn't on repairing relationships, it was on holding scores, protecting leverage, and controlling outcomes. Watching him, it became clear that calmness doesn't equal neutrality. He had shaped the narrative around Jasmine, but never stepped into reconciliation himself. His power lay in subtle influence, in enforcing consequences without appearing aggressive. The tell-all ended, but the tension didn't. Accountability was demonstrated, but not forgiveness. There was resolution in the form of clarity, not comfort. Viewers were left to measure who acted responsibly, who avoided scrutiny, and who let emotion dictate choices. Every reaction, every silence, every decision on that stage revealed patterns that went beyond a single argument. It revealed ongoing behavioral truths. And just when you think the story pauses, the fallout off stage promises twists no one saw coming. The final moments weren't neat. Jasmine walked away still guarded. Natalie moved on with moral clarity. And Gino remained in control of his narrative. Nothing had been fully resolved, but the audience left with a complete picture of responsibility, manipulation, and the emotional cost of avoidance. The drama wasn't over. It had simply shifted into its next chapter, where private lives and public perception would continue to collide. Every glance, every silence, every word hinted that the story's consequences were only beginning. The tell-all had exposed behavior, clarified motives, and left the audience questioning who would truly change, who would repeat patterns, and how the family would navigate what comes next. The tension didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Behind the tell-all, Matt's presence looms larger than ever, and questions about trust are only growing louder. Dina conversations that were once background chatter are now impossible to ignore, and every interaction between Jasmine and Gino carries a shadow of doubt. The cracks that surfaced on stage aren't just drama, they're real stakes affecting decisions, relationships, and the family dynamic. As the dust settles, it's clear that the fallout will stretch far beyond one episode. Alliances shift, old patterns resurface, and even small comments carry weight in ways the audience may not immediately notice. Natalie's stance may have clarified one layer, but Jasmine's strategy, Gino's quiet control, and the ripple effect across the cast suggest that nothing is truly resolved. Tensions are simmering, and loyalty and trust will be tested in ways that will force every member of the group to confront choices they may have hoped to ignore. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every hesitation now carries a new meaning. The story isn't over. It's evolving. And the next episode promises to reveal exactly who will stand their ground, who will bend under pressure, and which secrets are finally going to force everyone into the open.